we are now live. Welcome everyone to Monday Meets, the Willow weekly series where we talk to staff, partners, other agencies, anyone we want to spend a little time with about their programs, what they do, and who they are. It's an informal chat session. If you have any questions for our guests today at any time, you can leave those in the comment section. If you don't feel comfortable leaving a question, you prefer to do it anonymously, I will put my email down in the comments, and you can feel free to email me and I can work that in. If you're watching a recording of this, but you'd still like to know something, we'd be happy to go ahead and answer that for you. I'll leave my email in the YouTube link as well, so we'll have all that taken care of. Very excited today. This is a conversation that we were actually supposed to have a couple of weeks ago, but unfortunately, I had some health problems around my way. So thank you both for being super flexible.
Yeah, no problem.
We were in Human Trafficking Awareness Month, so this is sort of a conversation about the intersection between the Willow and Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters on how we work together in relationship to human trafficking and mental health issues in the Human Trafficking Task Force here in town. So I would love it if you guys could just take a moment and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about how you got into the Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters game.
Sure. I'm Erica Molde, and I actually started at KSPHQ as a volunteer in 2014. And so as a volunteer, I was answering the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and was a volunteer for a couple of years and have been just kind of around at KSPHQ in various capacities. And I'm now the Zero Suicide Program Coordinator for our resource center. And I got into this work primarily because of my own lived experience as a suicide attempt survivor, and also just caring a lot about people who have been suicidal in the past or have attempted suicide, etc. So very near and dear to my heart.
And my name is Jared Auten, and I'm the crisis line coordinator at KSPHQ. And like Erica, I was a volunteer. So I went through volunteer training in the spring of 2013 and have also been around ever since in some capacity. And I was hired at HQ in, I guess, 2020. So January of 2020. So I've been here 2 years. A fun fact is I also was a student intern at the Willow. And so I was working with the human trafficking team, providing support to survivors in the community and in the jail setting. So that experience was pretty incredible. And so maybe I'll get to reflect on that a little bit today.
Yeah, that would be awesome. So let me ask you this. I mean, I was a little as someone who doesn't kind of regularly connect with you all. I was a little bit surprised that KSPHQ was part of the Human Trafficking Task Force, just because the Venn diagram between trafficking and suicide prevention doesn't immediately kind of seem like it would connect. Can we start by just talking a little bit about your programs and how those sort of relate to trafficking?
Yeah, I might start on the counseling side of things and then have Erica fill you in about what the Kansas Suicide Prevention Resource Center is doing. But Headquarters Counseling Center, which is our program that has answered calls from people experiencing emotional distress or crises for over 50 years, has probably interacted with survivors of trafficking or domestic violence since it began. And as a crisis center that also answers the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, we come across folks from a variety of backgrounds and experiences who are dealing with some type of crisis. And a crisis is ultimately whatever it is for that person or is self-defined. So, really suicide prevention intersects with all manners of life experiences. And so, yeah, our programs are certainly a resource that's available to victims and survivors of trafficking. And I think one of the things that, we talk about in relation to suicide in general or suicidal thoughts is that commonly if a person is feeling trapped or we're feeling like there is a lack of options, suicide could present itself as an option. And so if we think about common experiences around human trafficking or any type of gender-based violence, a person is probably really likely to feel trapped. And so that's just kind of a simple example, I guess, of how suicide might intersect. And then we also know that the intersection is probably one with lots of different, and there's lots of contributing factors for how a person might get to a suicidal crisis.
I think there are a lot of shared risk factors too. If we think about some experiences that people have had as survivors of human trafficking, how drugs can be involved. And we also know that when substances are part of a person's life, that can drastically increase their risk for suicide as well, whether those substances are, chosen or forced, right? So I think there are a lot of just different, complexities that make these two issues closely related. And I also think about people who have had these experiences and have not been believed or can't get anything, any justice or anything done about that, and how that can contribute to those feelings of being trapped and desperate, really, for some other option. And so, in terms of services, that means we have probably talked to a lot of people who on our hotline, which is a 24/7 free and confidential hotline that anyone can call at any time.
You want to give us that number, just Erica, just so people have it?
Yeah, so I'll give you two numbers.
Okay.
Our local line is 785-841-2345. And then we also answer the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. And we answer that for the state of Kansas. So if anyone has a Kansas area code, there's a good chance that your call is going to come to us. Go ahead.
You might be getting ready to say this, but I think the work that specifically you and the Resource Center does around training providers. So
so we do a lot of direct service or interactions with people who are at risk or people who are struggling. But then we also have this other program called the Kansas Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which is the side that I work on now, where we provide training across the state for really anyone, but often it's like service providers, whether they're therapists or advocates or whatever their role is in the community, in supporting folks who have some of these gender-based violence experiences, or really just any other mental health related concern. We train them on being able to identify people who might be at risk for suicide, screen folks for their level of risk, and what to do when they have identified someone. So lots of how to support someone who's thinking about suicide, which I think there's a lot of crossover between the two issues when you're talking with someone who's thinking about suicide, but also talking with someone who has been trafficked. I think there's a lot of similarities in the way that we support those folks. So that's kind of an overview of most of what we do. There's a lot.
Yeah, no, I really, really appreciate that. And if anything else comes up throughout the course of that conversation, feel free to, or if you remember anything, feel free to just kind of stop and let us know, because we really do want to get a sense of the breadth of your program. I think you all are a lot like us, and that people kind of look at you as one thing, the call center, but you have so many other programs. People look at us as the shelter, but we have so many other programs as well. So I really hope we can highlight some of those as we continue through the conversation.
For sure. Yeah.
So a lot of times we try to kind of bring this into give people some information, some tips, to let them know kind of what we do, go out and give presentations, what kind of tips and help and ideas you're giving to members of the community if there's a situation in which someone is experiencing a mental health crisis. What are the best ways to help someone in that position?
It's a good question. Jared, you want to go?
Sure. One of the things that I guess kind of simplifies the support that we provide is ultimately it's important to listen. It's important to hear the feelings that person's experiencing, and if you get an inclination or if a person is presenting with warning signs that they might be thinking about suicide, if they're talking about suicide specifically, it's really important to ask directly, are you thinking about suicide? That's specific to suicide. And so I guess distinguishing between suicide and a mental health crisis, no matter what, if you ask about suicide, it's really a no harm question. You know, if the person says yes, then you can kind of move through what support looks like and how to support them in staying safe. And if the answer is no, then you can talk about whatever it is that's causing them some distress or is related to their mental health concern. So above all, listening and asking the question is kind of the entry point into supporting something, to supporting someone, and then ultimately getting them connected to a support that's comfortable for them, whether that's calling the crisis line, whether that's seeing a therapist, and depending on the severity of what they're experiencing, getting them the right care in the right moment.
If they're in a situation where I'm wondering, do you work a little bit like the Willow, that you do need the person who's experiencing the crisis to call, but somebody else can call with them, or can somebody call on behalf of someone experiencing crisis? How does that work?
Yeah, we get calls from a lot of people. I think it's a little bit different than maybe what you all are used to at the Willow, just because there are times where we might cold call someone if someone that cares about that person calls us and is like, hey, I'm really worried about my friend, I don't know what to do. And we talk, we talk about that, and eventually we get to a place where we're talking about options. And one of the options that we do provide is that we would be willing to call that person, but we have no idea if they'll answer. But in those cases, we also want to make sure that that would be a safe option for that person. So, if they're in, any situation where it might not be safe to give them a phone call, that's not an option then. But yeah, we get calls from people who are telling us, hey, I'm suicidal, I need help, or I just need to talk about it, or I've had a bad day and I need to talk about it. Maybe they're not suicidal, but then also we get calls from folks who are just worried about someone they care about. And sometimes we get calls where the support person is calling with the suicidal person. So it looks different all the time.
I think to add on to that, a common misconception is that you can only call us if you're suicidal. And in an ideal world, people feel comfortable calling us before they reach that point where things are in immediate crisis right now. We want to be there to listen and provide support before things kind of spill over, so to speak. And because what we know is that having someone provide non-judgmental and empathetic support can really reduce a person's stress level. It can give them, it presents them with the opportunity to gain clarity over their circumstances. And we really work hard to make sure that the support that is provided is non-judgmental. We work hard to train counselors to set aside their own personal biases so that they can support people from all walks of life, regardless of their belief or value system. So yeah, we really highly encourage people to call before they reach that point of crisis.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. I just want to take a moment to remind everyone that we are here with KSPHQ right now, having a Monday Meets conversation. This conversation is open, and we encourage your comments and reactions. You can feel free to leave those in the comments section. If you don't feel comfortable leaving them in the comments section, you can email me at waverill@willowdvcenter.org, and I'll get it worked into the conversation. That email is down in the comments as well. And if you need to contact the Willow, you can do so at 785-843-3333. And KSPHQ, you can contact locally at 785-841-2345. And the national hotline is 1-800-273-8625.
8255.
8255. I got an extra 6 in there. 8255. All right. 273-8255. So thank you so much for joining us. Now we're going to move on a little bit. We talked a bit before we actually started today's broadcast, and you had both mentioned that while you were aware of the human trafficking task force, it was currently a different person who was working with it. So let's just kind of talk about, rather than the specifics of what's happening in the task force, what benefits do you all see to having KSPHQ involved with the task force, and how does that, what do they bring back from those meetings?
That's a good question. I think that I think there are a lot of benefits, but the one that comes to mind automatically for me is just the opportunity to like get some continuing education around how might a human trafficking survivor present themselves, what might be some of the situations that they're facing or experiences that they've had, and how can we support those folks. So I think it by sending someone from KSPHQ to be on the task force, it helps us stay aware of any updates that are happening locally, but then also just the issue itself, being able to continue to educate ourselves, and then bring that back to KSPHQ so that we can educate our volunteers who are answering the phone and supporting trafficking survivors. So I think one of the things that's hard is that we don't always know if someone is a trafficking survivor unless they identify that themselves. And so we've probably talked to a lot of folks who have had this experience, but we might not have known that that's something that was a part of their experience unless they self-disclose. So I think just being prepared to be able to respond to those kinds of calls if we get them or when we get them is the main benefit that comes to mind for me.
And then I think the benefit maybe that we provide is some of that knowledge and expertise around suicide and crisis care. Back to kind of what we talked about at the top of the conversation, the fact that human trafficking survivors are at an increased risk for suicidal thoughts and suicide behaviors. We can bring some of that knowledge around what safe and evidence-based care looks like for suicide specifically, and what that might look like in different settings, whether it's in a hospital setting or whether it's in a like a clinical setting or a shelter setting. So
yeah, that's a good point.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned, Erica, just to tag back to what you said a little bit. One thing that's come up time and time again in the course of these Human Trafficking Awareness Month conversations is the awareness by the person who is experiencing trafficking that they are being trafficked is sometimes, first of all, it's difficult to pinpoint because we do screen for trafficking once people come into intake, but we don't directly. We will ask, but people may not consider what they're doing to be quote unquote trafficking, especially in situations like survival sex. It may be considered just kind of getting by rather than they consider themselves being trafficked. So it creates a real difficult barrier to all services, I would imagine, when folks are either not aware or not defining themselves as currently being trafficked. So that is something I think a lot of the other folks have mentioned as well. Thought it was an interesting point.
Yeah, it can be really hard. And it makes sense, right? It makes sense that people don't always know how to define their experience or aren't there yet with how they are defining their experience. And we would never want to like force that onto them. But I just, based on my past like work experience, because I was an advocate and a therapist at the care center, so I did work with some folks who had been trafficked, and I think it makes sense for us to like be educated and aware of some of the things that could come up on the phones, because we talked about like supporting people when they call, and I think one of the biggest things is that we have some awareness of no matter how this person is defining their experience, of what their options are, and that we're able to like let them know, hey, these are the options that you have. What feels most empowering to you? What decision or what is the thing that you feel like you need the most, and being able to empower them and have some control over their circumstance in that way.
Great. Now, I'm interested to know what challenges you see from your work on the hotline that are there any challenges which seem specific to trafficking survivors? You touched on that a little. You've done work at the care center with trafficking survivors, and at the Willow, we do have definitely. They're slightly there's some things that are less effective with trafficking survivors than they are with DV survivors, and some things that are more effective. What are the challenges that you find with serving trafficking survivors at the hotline?
I mean, I think like circumstances, right? Like we can support someone in an emotional crisis. We can talk about internal coping skills and what can help them feel soothed or calmed right there, but we can't get them out of a situation if that's what they want, right? Like I think it's about like what options do they have, what does feel safe to them, and sometimes we can't deliver those things. And I think that's what's hardest for, at least for me in working with folks, is like feeling helpless. Like what can I do right now that would be safe for you, that we have control over. So I think there's a lot of that for me that comes up.
And I think too, Eric and I had talked about this prior, but one of the things that I think was imparted on me during my time at the Willow was that it's incredibly important to place survivors at the center of the care that they're receiving and make sure that they have power and control over the decisions that they're making. And I think when working with a human trafficking survivor, there's that desire to help, and kind of this touches on what Erica was just saying, but you want to provide as much as you can to help them, and there are legitimate and real barriers that can get in the way of a person accessing the support or safety that they're trying to seek. So we really try hard to embody that same approach, that we put people in the driver's seat, and we want to support their autonomy to make decisions that are best for them in the moment.
Yeah, and that they know are safest for them, because we don't ever assume that we know what's best for another person, or that we know what's safest for another person. And I think that that's one of the most important parts of what we do, and also something that can be challenging.
Yeah, most definitely.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. I think that's really an important point, is not only just believing survivors in any situation, but also empowering them to make those decisions. And it is a huge challenge with trafficking survivors whose lives are intentionally kind of kept by their abusers and traffickers in a state of constant crisis. To have that time and that space to try to unwrap some of that can be extraordinarily challenging.
Something else that comes to mind as you were talking just now is that one of the things that we do on the hotline is we, especially when someone has expressed suicidal ideation, we tend to offer follow-up calls, and that can be particularly challenging for a trafficking survivor or a domestic violence survivor too, because we can't offer a follow-up call and assume that that's going to be safe. We ask a lot of safety questions, but I think that can we aren't able to follow up very often with folks in those situations because it's not safe for them. They have to be able to call us when it's safe for them, and we would never want to jeopardize or get them in trouble or, anything like that by calling.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a difficult line, and you don't want to put somebody potentially at risk.
Yeah.
What would you like to? The question I've been asking most of the organizations is, what would you like to see the human trafficking task force do moving forward? I'm going to broaden this one out a little bit and say, what would you like to see sort of awareness raising within the community about issues related to human trafficking and your and suicide prevention?
I mean, for me, I'm a big time nerd when it comes to just like education and awareness. And so I would love for there to be more information on the intersection of human trafficking and suicidality. I would also love for, in a perfect world, we would all be trained as advocates who are also on the hotline, who really I think we do a really good job of training hotline volunteers, but there's just so much to learn about those nuances, right? And I think it would be really cool to have some more education around what are the options when it comes to supporting trafficking survivors, and what are the best ways to help in any time we come across someone who is thinking about suicide and also has this experience.
I think since Erica kind of took the education and awareness level, which I would also support, I think I'll take the broader level response, because suicide prevention and human trafficking are both issues that are impacted by systems level and policy decisions that are really important to focus on. And whatever we can do at our county or community level or state level to address human trafficking and suicide prevention, whether that's working to improve people's economic circumstances or their access to care, I think those things can be front of mind, in addition to some of the things that happen on the more micro level or the more education and awareness level.
Makes sense. I like that answer.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming to join us today. Before we shut it all down, I do like to give folks a little time to make shout outs or talk about anything that's going on in your organization that you kind of wanted to let our folks know about, let people know about within the community. What's happening? What's next?
Yeah. One thing that I do want to plug that we didn't mention as a part of our services is that on the counseling center side, we do have a clinic where folks can access mental health services for a suggested donation of $10, which obviously is not a requirement. And those services are provided by master's level interns who are supervised by clinicians. And so those can be like weekly therapy sessions, for instance. And so that is something that we do provide. We don't currently have a waiting list right now, which I think is important to know, because a lot of people do have a waiting list right now. So yeah, just wanted to plug that. And if anyone wants access to the clinic, I can provide my email address. And you can put it in all the links and stuff if you want.
Sounds great.
And then Jared, I think you were going to plug for volunteers, and then I can say the other thing.
Yeah, right now we are recruiting for volunteer counselors. So if anyone listening to this is interested in becoming a volunteer counselor, you can go to our website, which is ksphq.org. And I think it's /get involved. And you can let us know that you're interested in becoming a volunteer. We did just wrap up our informational sessions, but it may not be too late if you reach out to us. And the process of becoming a volunteer counselor includes lots of training, so you don't need any prior experience. And folks go through our training program with other individuals, and it's a delightful experience. And
it's so good.
It's how Erica and I got our start, and why we've stuck around. There's a big community of volunteers here locally and all over the country, really, that have come through our training program and our counseling center. And then one other thing I'll mention is folks may be hearing about 988 in the news or in the media. And soon, as in July, the lifeline will be transitioning to 988. And so people will call 988 instead of that 1-800 number that's hard to remember. We anticipate that will increase access. And there's also some legislation at the state level that people can be aware of. House Bill 2281 is in committee right now, and it's proposing a mechanism for funding 988 and sustaining crisis services in Kansas. And so that's something to check out and be aware of, and let your legislator know that you're in support of.
Yeah. And then the other thing, like I said, big time nerd about educating folks. I sent a link to our trainings and presentations page in the chat, so you can add that in the comments. But we provide lots of trainings through the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. That's a grant that's an agency that has been able to give us some money to be able to provide lots of education around suicide prevention, and specifically that supports the zero suicide framework in Kansas for free. So lots of opportunities to continue your education around suicide prevention and intervention.
And most of those are being conducted virtually, so from the comfort of your living room.
All right.
And by most of those, Jared means all of those.
Awesome.
Although I don't know about you, I'm looking forward to being back in person with people again. It's
Yeah.
a little lonely in the old Zoomiverse. Well, thank you so much for meeting with us today. We really do appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, just email myself or Erica. We'll be happy to get those answered for you. I'll put those questions, those email addresses up in the comments of the YouTube. Really do appreciate it, guys, and thank you so much. It was great talking to you, and look forward to hearing more from you all soon.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Will. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.